Today's video is going to deal with installing brake rotors, EBC rotors, on a 1982 Suzuki Gs1100E. There's a couple of pitfalls and a couple of things that you can learn from this video that'll make the job a lot easier. I ran into 2 or 3 little things that I tried to include on the video. Basically, these parts fit real well, except there's one little clearance issue you should be aware of. And once you're aware of that issue, I just think it'll make your diagnosing what the problem is a lot easier. And there's another one. I'll leave that for the end of the video. But basically, it's a bolt-on job, but there are a few little pitfalls. Today I'm going to try to show how I install a set of EBC rotors on my Gs1100E. It's a 1982. Very similar for most motorcycles. A couple of good tips that'll make the job easier if you've never done before. And I'll try not to leave out any steps. Now, usually brake rotors last a long time if you don't use the brakes hard, or you don't use it a lot, or you don't put a lot of mileage. Usually you just wear out the pucks. Well, the bike I'm going to work on today has over 73,000 miles. It's had more than one set of rotors, and I'm very fussy about brake performance. I like to keep it as linear and as good as I possibly can, even though these older bikes don't have the braking capacity of the new bikes. I like to keep them as good as I possibly can make. Now, just some generic information before we even start. Older bikes, like this bike is 44 years old, it's an RD400. The braking technology of the day, this are very, very thick. Used to be to drill holes in them and whatnot. You can replace the pucks with any number of different compounds for racing or for street use, but that discussion could go on forever. What I'm concerned with here are the rotors. The rotors on older bikes tend to warp up if you ride the bike hard or do a lot of track days. And if you look around my shop on the back wall, we keep some of the rotors. I have some downstairs in the shop. But rotors don't last forever on bikes that you ride hard. Now, when I upgraded and put EBC rotors on the FZR, we were doing track days at the time. The new rotors made all the difference in the world. Just generic information. The reason modern bikes, some of them, all of them, and some of the aftermarket ones, have these not only holes for cooling, but these edges. The reason for that is this is where the disc typically would warp, is right at the edge. And that's where you'd have the problem that the lever would be pumping when you'd go to give it hard braking. Well, it makes it a lot better when you have floating rotors. These rotors float. These buttons let this float side to side a little. These are called floating rotors. You notice the bike, the original rotors I'm taking off are not floating rotors. The new ones are. So the ones we're taking off here, if you run your hand here, you can feel they're grooved, and they're just old material. This is different material than they use nowadays. And they're not floaters. This rotor is hooked solidly to the hub, and the caliper moves back and forth on 2 pins. Well, this is an old school system, and it still works, and we're going to try to make it work even a little bit better, but it's never going to be, no matter what you do to this front end, it's never going to be like a modern sport bike is. It just is not. I don't think that's within the realm of doing. Maybe I'm wrong. Now, a couple of things. I have painted the wheels on most of the motorcycles in my collection. When you go to take the old rotors off of a wheel that has the factory Loctite, I have found the only realistic way to get that off without stripping the bolts is to use MAP gas and get it very, very hot. Now, because I've already had these wheels apart and painted them, I put it back with blue Loctite. I should be able to get the bolts off realistically on the bike we're going to work on today. But again, we'll see. And the MT-09 is the only bike in my collection that has ABS. And before I had a bike with ABS, I was skeptical. It convinced me the first time a deer ran out in front of me and I had to use it. It's wonderful. So before I even get started, I wanted to show the EBC rotors come in a beautiful box. This is the second set I've had on the GS. The first set lasted quite a while, but the new rotors, nothing to me makes the bike just have that nice linear lever feel as a brand new set of rotors. And on this bike, there is a left and there is a right. And just for reference sake, it lists all the pertinent information in the hub. It's laser cut into the hub. These are really, really nicely made, and they're made in England. And Pokey, thank you very much. This is the second set he's gotten for me. He's an EBC dealer. Now, I'm very old school about working on motorcycles, so the first thing I always want to do is make sure I have a right side and a left side. I don't have two the same. Otherwise, the holes are not going to, the holes in the rotors are going to look like, I don't know, like one isn't going to match the other to make it simple. Anyway, we do have the right rotors. So the first thing we always have to do in the shop, I'm working in a very confined area, is move the bike we're going to work on under the come-along, the electric come-along from Harbor Freight, and get it on the center stand and jacked up that we can remove the front wheel. The bike has a center stand. I always try to get it up on the spools on the sport bikes because I want the bike as stable as possible. Now keep in mind, all this stuff is safety because I usually, almost always, I'm working alone in a garage and I don't want to have any kind of drama. The electric winch, 75 bucks from Harbor Freight, worth its weight in gold. And I try very careful, never get to pinch any of the cables, the wires, any of the little accessories. Each bike is a little bit different, but I don't want to make it any more complicated than it is, so I just wrap it around the handlebar as close as I can to where it bolts in. It seems to work pretty good. Now, on a previous video, and it's on the channel, of course, I replaced the brake lines, 40-year-old, more than 40-year brake lines, with steel brake lines donated by Joe Padula. These worked out great. It's on a previous video. So step one is to take the speedometer cable off and remove the bolts that hold the caliper on and get the two calipers up out of the way. Now, a lot of this stuff is relatively straightforward and simple, but there's always some little tips that I find whenever I watch other people work, other people in their own shops. I always find little tips or little things that I can use to make my work easier. Now, getting I know people can change this without taking the calipers off and get the wheel in. Yes, but it's just easier for me to just take the calipers off and swing them up out of the way. So no matter when I'm doing a tire change or anything like this maintenance, just get the calipers out of the way. That is two bolts that hold the caliper to the carrier. Every bike is different. This one comes apart relatively straightforward. I want to take brake cleaner parts, clean these all up. These have plenty of meat on them, so there's no point even thinking about we don't need to buy pads for a while. Relatively new, and of course the dust washers keep this, the part that this slides on. This is where the caliper actually slides. So there's a special grease. I see there's plenty of grease on there. I'm not going to over grease it either. It's a special high temperature grease you put on those bolts. So with that apart, now we want to tie this up just so it's out of the way. That's the whole objective here. A couple of zip ties, and we got the cable. We'll have that one out of the way, and we'll do the same thing to the other side. Now, I don't want to get any brake parts cleaner anywheres near paint. That's for sure. This is just to clean these up a little before when we do the reverse assembly. Okay, that takes care of the first side. Again, brake part cleaner can ruin some paint, some powder coating. I don't want it anywhere it isn't supposed to be. Okay, so we have a couple of zip ties just holding that up out of the way. It'll make removing the wheel so much easier. And the next thing is just repeat everything I did on the other side except for the speedometer cable on this side, and we'll be ready to pull the wheel. Okay, I got all the parts off, all cleaned. We're ready to pull the lower bolts off and then pull the axle. All this stuff is Loctited, so it really takes a few seconds to get each one of the bolts loose. And out comes the speedometer drive, the spacers, and we got a spacer on the other side. I always put the spacers on the side they go on, even though they are different. Now, I almost forgot, on this bike you have to remove the carriers too, the caliper carriers. No big deal, these come right off. Now, when you don't want to work on a bike in a while, you forget these have to come off too. And a follow-up on that is I always try to keep the parts from one side of the bike on one side and put another towel down on the other side. And I think there's a case to be made. If you were going to put these pucks back in and use the same rotors, you'd want to use the same pucks in the same side and everything. But in this case, all bets are off. So if my memory serves me right, you really only have to take one off, and in which case that'll save us just a little bit of time. Okay, wheel is off, ready to clean it up. Now before I do anything, I always like to start with clean stuff. It's just me. I don't want to be getting fingerprints on everything, and it's hard enough when things are clean to get everything to look nice. Okay, we're finally ready to remove the discs, and since I put those bolts in with blue Loctite, I'm hoping they're going to come out without an adventure, but you never really know these things. So, but the first thing is to have a coffee break. That'll get us started. It's getting hot out here. These mornings start off chilly, but boy, it doesn't take long and it gets hot. Anyway, we're ready to pull the discs right after I have some coffee. Now, this is the key to getting a job done right. Extra coffee. This day went from being really chilly to right now it is really getting hot and humid out there. You never know. You never can predict the weather here. Now it looks like, in any indication, the first bolt with the blue Loctite is coming out. So it may be our lucky day. And this just takes time. These bolts, when they're Loctited like this, you got to have the wrench on them right to the very end. I like to use blue Loctite because most of the times I know at some future time I'm going to want to work on something again. The factory almost always uses red Loctite. And needless to say, when I put the other disc on, the other one, there's a left and a right. I want to get them correct, of course. And it orients the way the slots or the holes are. And I think it's probably just for cosmetic reasons. There's a left and a right. Not sure. There's really a good chance to get down into all these little nooks and crannies that I have to use a stick to get to. Otherwise, may as well just clean this up a little bit. And I always like to work with clean stuff. I hate working with something you're all greasy and dirty, and clean stuff makes it a lot more fun to work on. Alright, I'm making sure that I have the left side on the left side. That's always good to do that. And that the cover for the speedometer gear goes on this side. I do believe. Yes, it does. That goes on that side. That goes on that side. I want to Loctite all the bolts. Blue Loctite, by the way, blue. Now when I'm tightening these down, I'm going to try to get them all kind of equal and then torque them like you torque the head of a motorcycle or the head of a car in a star pattern. So the first thing is to get them all hand tight. The thing I wanted to avoid, and I think this might be over here, is tighten one, tighten two. You want to go opposite. And I think that's true of most things. Now it's really just common sense when you think about it to go in a star pattern or go back and forth, side to side, not to tighten one bolt all the way. And you just put tension on it for no reason at all. And in this case, when we're Loctiting everything together with blue Loctite, I'm hoping once it's torqued down, it's going to stay that way for a very, very long time. Now this is pretty funny. I have the Harbor Freight torque wrench and I have the Craftsman one, and they're pretty similar. They're actually real similar, in fact. So torquing these down, again, a star pattern is the way to go here. And these bolts are bolts that it pays to do accurately with a torque wrench. Now anytime I'm working on two sides of something or two similar things, I always notice the second one always seems to go just a little bit smoother and a little bit faster. Alright, both discs are on, they're torqued down, ready to put the front wheel back. One of the quirks of this bike, before you tighten up the axle, this has to be in the position that you want it in to receive the cable, and we want to
do that right now. Because if this is in the wrong position, or if you lock this up, this will just spin around. You'll destroy either the cable or something. It's really important that you can spin the wheel and this doesn't turn. This has to turn free, or else you're not engaging that gear. You see, once I can turn the wheel free, totally free, and that's not trying to move, I know I've got the gear engaged right. And the next thing is to tighten the axle up. And before I tighten that axle nut, I want to make sure this. What happens is this side is going to hold the axle from turning. So what I had to do, I had to take this all apart again. This piece here is an interference for the speedometer drive because this piece on an EBC disc is just a little bit thicker. And it makes this part come out and it rubs on the speedometer gear where the stock part doesn't. Now, I don't know that, well, I guess we're going to find out. I don't know that it's just a dust cover anyway. So what I'm going to do is take this piece off. And by the way, for some reason, I do remember having to do this when I put the first EBC discs on, and I just forgot. But anyway, that piece has to come off. And here's the set of original EBC discs that went about 30,000 miles, I believe. I got to look at the log. But now that I've gone through this, I do remember it. Now, it's really shame on me for not remembering that, but I'll bet you any money if I were to look on my channel and look at the original thing of retrofitting the discs, I'll bet it's on there. See? So I have to watch more of my own channel, that's for sure. Anyway, this is why it's worth having a video like this. See, and now I don't know how many people would have figured this out. I don't know why I figured it out, but this is the kind of thing you want to retrofit something. And think of those, the RD carburetors are a good thing. You call up Sudco, oh yeah, they're a bolt-on, and it takes you 3 days of making adapters and drilling holes and everything. It's not always a bolt. Aftermarket parts are not always a bolt-on fit. So I guess that's why we make the videos. I'm going to guess that now, once I remove this piece, and it's really just a dust cover, that speedometer drive is going to have no interference at all. I can see it was rubbing on the edge of this, and that was the interference problem I was having. Now I wanted to really focus in on this because this is the problem. When that dust cover was on there, here's what was happening. This was rubbing on the dust cover because this piece is a couple of thousandths too thick. Well, I could have taken a dust cover and put it in a lathe and machined it down or anything, but I don't really think that dust cover is doing much. But now I can see I'm engaged in there where I should be. And by the way, you can put this, I'm not sure I even mentioned this, you can put this axle together, tighten it all up, and then just pull it up into the forks. There's a lot of ways to do it, whatever you're comfortable with. But just like taking a back wheel off, you can take those little things off the back. But I'm guilty of doing everything the old school way.
And no matter how you put the front wheel on, it's nice to have a helper. The only problem is I never have a helper. I got to do all this stuff alone.
So now it's just a question of hooking up the speedometer cable, making sure we have that all free and clear, and we are pretty much good to go. Now the last thing on this is to fit the caliper carriers and the calipers back, just reverse of taking them off. And sometimes, and I do remember this from the first time, there's an interference fit and you have to grind a little bit off the back of this to make space for the buttons. I don't know if that's going to happen until I get this installed and get the caliper on and see if there's an interference. And if there is, I've got to grind away some material to make room for the buttons. Now let's just see. No, this one's okay. You don't know if the other one's going to be okay though. So we'll do one at a time. To show this side has no interference from the buttons. There's nothing there, so that's one thing good. Now we got one side buttoned up here, I think. We got to check for some interference on the other side, and we'll figure that out right away. Okay. Now we got these discs have buttons on them. The original ones don't. Step it away, I make sure I have no interference. Everything's good. That should be one side done. So I did have to take a little bit of material off, just a little bit. It was just touching the buttons, and I just was not happy with that. I know probably I could have gotten away with it, but just run a little grinder on that. That'll give us some clearance. I don't want to have any interference on this at all. Now I'm not sure you can see how tight the clearance is around those buttons, but one of the things that was happening is the lower bolt was interfering with it, and what I did on the other side, that side by the way worked out fine. This side I had a little bit of interference, and I wound up putting a washer on the bottom bolt, and that got rid of all of the interference. And it's not like the wheel wouldn't turn, it's just this click, 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 and I didn't want to have the buttons all scuffed up. And I don't know why I remember that I did have some issues like that the first time I did this. But anyway, that's 2 good tips, 3 good tips, well, a lot of good tips. Next thing is just put the calipers back on, and let's see what we got. So what I learned from this whole job, and part of it I had already learned once already, is that little dust cover can be a problem if it interferes with the speedometer drive. So that's worth knowing, that's for sure. And that lower bolt can be a problem. You can just put a washer behind it, but you can see once you take care of that, there's no clearance issues at all. And I hope that's worth its weight, or worth the time you spent watching the video. Now that I think is always the last step of everything, even cleaning the bike. Clean the rotors with some brake part cleaner. I want to get both sides clean. When I do get a chance to go for a ride, we'll let these brakes sit in for a couple of rides anyway before we start really abusing them, but we abuse everything. The whole idea of having brakes is you want to use them, and when the day you need them, the day Bambi runs out in front of you or whatever, well, you're glad you did all this work. Everything's tight, everything's Loctited. We're good to go. So before I end the video, I just hope some of these little tips and tricks and things that I try to make the videos real, try to include the things that I forget along the way, and today was just a good example of that. So anyway, but knowing that little speedometer thing might be an interference, if you're going to do EBC brakes, that might be it might be that way on other bikes too. I don't know. That somebody miscalculated that dimension out by a few thousandths, but I do know EBC stuff is really good quality. Usually it's a snap-on fit. In my case, it was just that lower bolt that was a little bit too long, and it only takes a couple of thousandths and something is an interference and it makes you crazy. Now we got that all straightened out. We should be ready for a test ride in the next few days. So before I end the video, I want to thank Joe Padula again for the steel brake lines. So we now have steel brake lines, brand new rotors, plenty of meat on the pucks, and it'll be a real next couple rides. Get the brakes to seat in, usually a couple 100 miles, and then they're really ready to go, and we'll be ready to go. So the last step of every job, get the fingerprints off, get all the dust and everything off, get this ready for another ride, another day out on the open road. And because I've had this bike since new, it always has a special little place in my heart. I do try to keep it as clean as possible, as nice as possible, and of course mechanically correct. So I hope you did enjoy the video, and thanks so much for watching.
Now it seems like every job I do, and keep in mind I am a backyard mechanic, I have to invent some tools along the way and different things, and I'm always learning something. And because I enjoy learning, I enjoy sharing too. And by editing down these videos, trying to make them fun to watch, I hope people that have the same passion I have for keeping these old bikes running, keeping them restored, and of course riding the wheels off them. And most of my friends fit into that category. We try to ride all season long. If you're new to this channel, maybe this is the first video you've ever watched, we try to work on other people's bikes over the winter. We always have something unique going on here. We're always going somewhere to join up with our friends, ride together. We have a bunch of Ninjas we like working on, and I have two of these GS's that really I have one bike registered, but the other bike is a parts bike, and it's very handy to have. This is the West Cooley variant of the bike, and riding them both, it's just a lot of fun. Having a parts bike, priceless. There's no way you can tell somebody until you have a parts bike how useful it is from time to time. Anyway, and we do enjoy, of course, all of the work that we do on the bike. We try to make it as mechanically correct as the appearance, the painting, the polishing, and keeping bolts tight, and most of all, just enjoy editing down the video and sharing it with our friends. And when we get together, harassing each other in good humor. Anyway, so I do hope you did enjoy the video. We do try to post something up every day. And thanks so much for watching.